All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I'm Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. I've been waiting for this meeting for a long time. This is going to be a lot of fun. The last Comiskey project initially started as a diversion for first-time documentarian Matt Flesch during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the producer, writer, and director of the film, Matt created a documentary available in 3 parts on YouTube that captures all the key moments from Comiskey Park's final season, including the surprising pennant chase by the plucky young underdog White Sox. The backbone of the film are home movies, stories, and photographs from fans. The book of the same name serves as a permanent companion to the documentary that will provide a physical and tangible reminder of that final surprising season at Sox Park. It blends both Ken Smoller's photographs along with content from the documentary, supplemented by new material to provide greater context. The book is intended to capture the spirit of the documentary and the reflections of many participants in the interviews Matt conducted for the film. Ken Smoller is a photographer and writer based in Brookline, Massachusetts, with childhood roots in Chicagoland. In over 3 decades of extensive traveling, he has photographed more than, get this, 2,350 stadiums in 48 states and 24 countries. His mantra is that one of the best ways to understand the culture and fabric of a place is through its sporting arenas and stadiums. And he's here tonight to discuss his book, Last Comiskey. Ken Smoller, welcome to Northern New England. How are you this evening?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much. Great to see everyone. Great to see Dan Evans there, who is a big part of this book and will, I am sure, jump in and correct me on a couple of items, because we're going to talk a little bit about what could have been. And he was there in the room when it was happening. So he will be able to correct me and give the real deal in the end at Q&A time. So be kind to me, Dan. But great to be here. As mentioned, I am a kind of half of my life, I was a Chicagoan growing up in Arlington Heights in the northwest suburbs. And I moved to Brookline, Mass in '97 and live about 2 miles away from Fenway Park. Try to walk there as much as I can to work off all the bad food I eat there. But my first love is Comiskey Park, and that's where I learned how to photograph stadiums, how to learned a lot about life at Comiskey Park. And when Matt had approached really everyone to try to contribute to this book, to the movie that he did, I had hundreds and hundreds of photographs that I volunteered. And we only needed, some of them for the transitions and background material in the movie. And I really felt like baseball fans in general would want to get a window back in time at one of the ballparks that was maybe not as beloved as Fenway, Wrigley, Yankee, or Tiger. But for the people who really knew it, it was one of the most special places in the world, and arguably was, I think, a little bit better than Tiger Stadium in certain ways. They're really comparable. And we talk about that in the book. It is put out on Eckhartz Press, which is a Chicago boutique publisher. And we have over 400 photographs in the book. They're all mine, other than a handful where we filled in some gaps. I have, as mentioned before, I've been to 2,300 plus stadiums. I should hit 2,400 this summer, all around the world, not always for games. I sneak into ballparks. I get friendly guides, get friendly ushers or security people to let me in, or go for things like Jehovah's Witness rallies or Promise Keeper events or whatever's going on, a circus, whatever's going on in the stadium. I just try to get in and get at least one photograph of each one. I've been to about 500-600 ballparks, and we'll show some of those throughout this process. Here is Mexico City for the Mexico City series last year, one of my favorite new ballparks. Japan, Koshin, for those who have been in outside of Kyoto, where the Hanshin Tigers, the Boston Red Sox of Japan, play. Side story, by the way, be prepared. There will be lots of tangents and cutaways. For those of you who watch Family Guy, consider this to be the baseball ballpark photo equivalent to that, where I'm going to do a lot of cutaways and tangents. So this will be a manifestation of my ADHD coming out. So another, the Expos, for those of you who remember, played their last 2 seasons at home in Puerto Rico. So I needed to make sure that I got down for Hiram Bithorn Stadium to see them before they embarked on their new life as the Washington Nationals. We've got some ballparks that are not as good as others. We had the old Metrodome, another New England gem that no longer is in use, McCoy Stadium, where the Paw Sox used to play, and another stadium that was really a beautiful one down in Camden, New Jersey, which sadly only lasted about 20 years before it was demolished.
Pardon me, Ken, are you sharing your screen?
Is it not showing?
Nope.
Okay, then that's why this has not been interesting. Okay, just a second. Let's redo it.
Interesting. We just want to make sure that you're the.
All right, let's redo it. We had shared it, and I think it got cut out when we let everyone in. Hold on one second.
Thank you, Dixie, for
thank you.
Plug there. Appreciate that.
All right. How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. All right, let's get back. I'm just going to quickly go back into the beginning here. So you should be able to see the cover of the book and Last Comiskey. Is that visible? Can everyone see? Shake heads? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So just to kind of go back through here, the whole screen is there? Can everyone see a baby in the right-hand corner? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is Mexico City. This is the Mexico City series. I'll just go through quickly to show folks. Here is the Hanshin Tiger Stadium in outside of Kyoto. The Puerto Rico Stadium, Hiram Bithorn. The Metrodome, which beloved by few. McCoy Stadium back in Pawtucket in its final season. And this is Campbell's Ballpark in Camden, New Jersey, with the Ben Franklin Bridge in the background. And here's where we left off. This coming week, we have Rickwood Field is going to be a brand new Major League ballpark hosting the Cardinals, and I believe the Giants will be there on, I think, Thursday of this week. So that becomes a Major League ballpark. Interestingly, it opened up 6 weeks after Comiskey Park opened up in August of 1910, which really is salient because for those folks who've been there, when you walk around it, it really feels like old Comiskey Park in a lot of ways, the way the concourses feel and just the overall look of the ballpark. And then back going for the ballparks around the world, here's the very first London series back in 2019, when they really tried to replicate the foul territory of Oakland Coliseum in converting West Ham's stadium into a ballpark. They've done a little bit better job since then. And then lastly, I think we have in Brooklyn, where the Brooklyn Cyclones play. I don't know what the current name is. It's changed every year. This is actually the Nathan's Hot Dog Competition, which you're not going to unfortunately see Joey Chestnut, I guess, anymore going forward. But this was another one of those great ballparks. And then lastly, modern Woodman Field. This was taken right from the top of the Ferris wheel in Waterloo, Iowa. Another real treasure for those people who like to wander around and see different ballparks. We released the book about a month ago and had a big book launch in Chicago last month in the Chicago Historical Society, now known as the Chicago History Museum. Broadcaster Tom Scher, who was on The Score for many years in Chicago, also WMAQ, which is the NBC affiliate, was our MC. We had on the far left, Don Paul, a former White Sox pitcher who lived the dream of pitching for his hometown team. Behind there, you see Jack McDowell, who is the 93 Cy Young Award winner on the White Sox, who pitched in the last year of Old Comiskey and also pitched the first game, which was a debacle against the Tigers in New Comiskey, lost 16-0. He did tell me in the green room before this event that he thought the mound, and other pitchers thought, was a little too high, and it threw him off. Now, you wonder why it didn't affect the Tigers pitcher, But that was one of his comments that he made. Not an excuse, but he did say this. We also had Ron Kittle, who was one of the career leader for rooftop home runs at Old Comiskey Park. And then you'll see in the middle, Matt Flesh, who is the documentarian. And up front, of course, is the real hero of the book and the hero of the last years of Old Comiskey Park, Nancy Faust. For those who don't know, she was the organist for 41 seasons at Old Comiskey Park, best known for inaugurating Na 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 Hey Hey Goodbye as an anthem. She came up with the idea of a walk-up song, a distinct song for each player. She was one of the first, if not the first, female organist, and really brought popular music into the ballpark. She's just a treasured part of Chicago and baseball history. A lot of folks that she feel that she should have some special honors in the Hall of Fame. You know, if not an official Hall of Famer, but she should really be treasured in the Hall of Fame as being someone who was very significant with baseball. So this was the event last month. She really was the Willis Reed of the event because she badly broke her ankle in spring training and came off the DL with just 2 days to go and decided to show up for the event and really treat us to her music. But she's a treasure and is a real big part of the ballpark. The afterword of the book talks about my experience of getting to know her, my son's experience, my 15-year-old son. And so she really was a big part of this book. Every interviewee seemed to bring her up, it seems. I know Dan talked about her a lot. And the foreword to the book is by Ozzie Guillén, who really is the bridge from the old ballpark to the new ballpark. Ozzie, of course, started playing for the White Sox after the Lamar Hoyt trade in 1985. He was a key part of it when Lamar Hoyt, who was struggling after his 83 Cy Young Award year, Ozzie Guillén came, and by 1990, the final year of the ballpark, he was only, I think, about 28, 29 years old at the time and was listed as co-captain by manager Jeff Torborg, along with Carlton Fisk. You can't get a bigger difference between two guys, you know, New Hampshireite Carlton Fisk, along with young Venezuelan Ozzie Guillén, but they really worked some magic with the team. And of course, Ozzie played at the new ballpark for a number of years and managed the team to the 05 World Series win. So he is on the Mount Rushmore of the White Sox history and arguably could be on an extended Mount Rushmore of Chicago sports history. But now let's just, go back to the ballpark. This is just in 1987 on opening day, and you can see this is what it felt like in Old Comiskey Park. There still were brick roads right there on Shields, now known as Billvac Avenue, or Billvac Drive, excuse me. And it was aging, and to the right is where the new park now exists, just to the right of all those boxy mid-'80s cars. And it was in 87 and 88 that there was a lot of news about Jerry Reinsdorf and Eddie Einhorn wanting the owners of the ballpark, the team, to get a new ballpark. And ultimately it was torn down, as you can see, in 1991, and is really a parking lot now, as well as the site for the ramps for the new ballpark. But it was a special place. It had a cinematic feel to it with the arches, the views to the outside of the streets. You could see from inside, and it really was part of the neighborhood. New Comiskey Park was built just steps away from the old ballpark, and tried to evoke some of the feel of the old ballpark with the arches, and we're going to get into it in a little bit. It doesn't exactly capture the same feel as the old ballpark, and really has a little bit to be desired, and we'll talk about that. What I did with this book was capture the ballpark both inside and out. I took a few days off of my summer job while I was in college in 1990 and photographed really every nook and cranny of the ballpark. Not just the field and the players, but the outside, the concourse, and the people and the sites that made that place special. And this is something I did while I was a college photographer at the University of Michigan. I came back for the last weekend of the old ballpark, and it was really a special moment. They chased the Oakland A's, who, as we all know now, were pretty heavily juicing in those days, but they really gave it their all. They won 94 games, more than almost any White Sox team in history, but it was predating the wild card by a few years, and they unfortunately went home after September 30th, 1990. They had a series on the road, and that was it. They had a lot of great young stars. Dan sure knows about this. They had a draft that included, for 4 consecutive years, first-round picks such as Jack McDowell, Robin Ventura, Alex Fernandez, and of course, in 1990, in August, young Frank Thomas, who was a skinny little first baseman, well, yeah, that skinny, but relatively speaking, and he got his start at Old Comiskey Park, and debuted there for the last 2 months, and really got a chance to see that before he became the star at the new park, and really the most important White Sox player ever in their history. And of course, young Sammy Sosa was a triple hitter, base stealer, had some flashy defense sometimes. Sometimes he missed the easy ball, but he was a real part of the White Sox. And we talk about it in the book, but Frank Thomas spoke in an interview a few years ago that I guess it was his inability to work with, the batting style that was being proposed that Frank really was an expert in, of kind of, falling off with the bat and dropping that backhand. And he really did not want to buy into that system. He was a free swinging guy. And that was one of the reasons why they traded him for George Bell over to the Cubs just a couple years later. And then there are all sorts of great characters at the ballpark. Besides Nancy, you had Andy the Clown, who started as an unauthorized mascot, became a semi-authorized mascot, and then really was told by the ownership to move across to the new ballpark without the hat and the clown nose. So he did show up a couple times and never really got installed at the new ballpark. And I was a vendor in 1991, 2, and 3, and brought my camera that year in 91 to really capture the demolition of the ballpark from the new ballpark. Sadly, it is gone. And then we kind of leaned into the meat of my presentation, which is the White Sox and Comiskey Park are really a series of what ifs. And there are a whole bunch of what ifs that I always think about how it could have been different. And you go back to down the street from Fenway Park to the Hotel Buckminster for the biggest what if of them all. What if Chick Gandil had not met with New York gamblers in a hotel room in September of 1919 and agreed to throw the World Series? It all started there. This hotel still stands. It's being converted into other uses right now. There is a plaque there that talks about the fact that Joseph Sport Sullivan and Chick Gandil met in 1919, and that really changed the White Sox. You wonder what would have happened before free agency when players were static for years. What happens if you don't lose 8 star players from a team and gut them? Do they challenge the New York Yankees in the 20s, who had not won a single World Series at that time? Could they have been the greatest rivalry ever, the Sox and the Yankees, during that time? And instead, we have the ghosts now that you see in the cornfields of Iowa. This is before the Field of Dreams game in 2021. And they're legendary in film. But sadly, we had to wait till 2005 till we finally got a World Series in Chicago. After the gap from 1917 and 88 years, 2 years longer than the Red Sox curse, as many named Shaughnessy would call it. And they finally broke that streak in 2005 in Houston at a ballpark that is now an American League ballpark. So it really kind of felt surreal and weird that we didn't get the feel of what could have been a juggernaut in Chicago. You just wonder what could have been, how it could have been different. The second what if, now getting more into the ballpark, is what would have happened if Cub fan Governor Jim Thompson had not been successful in getting legislation allowing for financing for a new ballpark in 1988. For those people who don't know, the White Sox were flirting with a number of new locations for a ballpark. Suburban Addison, west of the city, was one location. They got very close and signed papers and even printed some T-shirts for the Florida White Sox, where they would have been in what was then called Thunderdome, which is now, of course, where the Tampa Bay Rays play, and it's not exactly a beloved ballpark. But instead, Jim Thompson persuaded enough downstate legislatures, also somehow persuaded the person in charge of the clock to stop it at 11:59-ish, when the midnight deadline was coming. Just one vote he got to get the funding to allow for the Illinois Sports Authority, Stadium Sports Authority, to fund New Comiskey Park, just south of Old Comiskey Park, across the street. Had he not done that, and he always did say he did not want to lose the White Sox on his watch, we maybe would be talking about a replacement for the White Sox dome right now in Florida, not the Rays dome. Instead, the Rays are fighting for a new park. But the White Sox, when the ownership group bought the team in 1981 from Bill Veeck, really kind of had a mission to get a new ballpark very early. There had been discussion about building a renovated Comiskey Park, like what they did in New York. But Jerry Reinsdorf and his engineers felt that Old Comiskey Park really had been left kind of fallow, and there was too much deferred maintenance for generations, that rebuilding the ballpark would have been a, quote, foolish use of money, and doing something like what was done with Yankee Stadium and having the White Sox play at either Shea Stadium or Wrigley Field. I'm sorry, County Stadium or Wrigley Field, the way that the Yankees played at Shea Stadium while Yankee Stadium was being rebuilt in 74 and 5, was an untenable solution. I kind of wonder whether that was the case. Most White Sox fans I know probably would have accepted a year or two at Wrigley or County Stadium in exchange for a rebuilt Comiskey Park. It doesn't seem to be something that was discussed terribly seriously. Dan probably knows more about that than I do. But I kind of think White Sox fans would have taken that bargain and been interlopers in another ballpark for a while. But sadly, that wasn't the case. And instead, we got New Comiskey Park, which arguably had a bigger foolish use of money, and that the top 8 rows of that ballpark that you're looking at now later got removed, analogous to FedEx Field, where Washington's football team plays. And they sold the naming rights to the ballpark to U.S. Cellular in exchange for millions of dollars to rebuild the ballpark, remove the top 8 rows, shrink the capacity down, really build it something that's a more analogous in a lot of ways to the feel of Yankee Stadium or Royal Stadium. They've done a good job of improving it. I'm not sure that that was the best way to spend the money in the long term, but that is the situation that White Sox fans and Southsiders have. Now, you can look here and see what they've done with the ballpark since then. New Comiskey Park on the top is photographed in April of 1990. This is during my vendor training orientation. I snuck this photo. And then the photo down below is the exact same view, almost taken last summer. You can see the differences. There have been improvements. They got rid of the Chicago Cubs blue seats, which White Sox fans dreaded. The old upper deck has been shrunk a bit. They put on a new roof and a facade there that really has a more intimate feel. They threw some Paris of Thought, some greenery in the outfield. White Sox fans were a little mixed about that, but they did do that, and it has improved. But very few people come to Chicago and say New Comiskey Park is anything other than adequate. And that's a little disappointing given what was built in the generation thereafter. This again is showing what would have been the alternatives. The White Sox could have played at Old County Stadium during a renovation. They actually played 18 games a year there in the late 60s, some exhibition games against the Cubs, but they played regular season games. Before the Brewers, the Seattle Pilots became the Brewers, the White Sox took advantage of the baseball void in Milwaukee and went 90 miles to the north, which is really not that far for a lot of Chicago. It can be less than an hour drive if you get it without traffic. Or they could have played at Wrigley Field. Obviously, that would have been a little controversial for some White Sox fans. So then let's go back and talk about rebuilding ballparks. There have been some ballparks that have been rebuilt. Down the road, and we'll talk about this in a minute, from where I live just by Fenway Park, and of course that has been rebuilt with great success. Wrigley Field, I would argue, was reconstructed with a little less success. If you look at the graceful lines of the outfield and the elegant scoreboard, it was lost with what the Ricketts family did. Instead, they put in a scoreboard that I think is analogous to having like a 90-inch television in a dorm room, and rebuilt the bleachers in a real maximum capacity way that took away that sort of elegance of the gentle slope of the outfield. You lost a lot of view of the neighboring skyline. They really didn't have the sensitivity that they did with Fenway Park. Furthermore, when you look at the outfield, it just doesn't feel the same as the way it did. Some elements are the same, some are different. The exterior portions feel a little bit like a suburban shopping mall or a hotel. I feel like it's like a plaza outside a Hyatt or a Hilton or a Marriott. Whereas the real gold standard for ballpark preservation was in Fenway Park. Janet Marie Smith, the legendary architect behind Camden Yards and the recent renovation of Dodger Stadium, Polar Park in Worcester, along with Larry Lucchino, really had the notion that they were caretakers of Fenway Park. They wanted to, quote unquote, do no harm. And they wanted elements of the ballpark that were new to fit in. And sure enough, I brought a friend there recently who had didn't know what was new and old. He could not figure out what was vintage 2012 and what was vintage 1947. If you look at the modern Fenway Park, it really did a better job than Wrigley of capturing the essence of Fenway, whether it's the paint colors blending in or just gentle touches that Janet Marie Smith did to find space in the ballpark. It really saved the park. And they had been talking about building a replica next door at the time. This is the actual brochure that had been thrown around to try to get people comfortable with the notion of building a replica Fenway Park. You can see in the top of that, they would have kept some portions of old Fenway Park. And the John Harrington ownership group, which was really the Yawkey Foundation, was touting this plan when John Henry took over the team in, I think it was 2002, 2003. And you saw bumper stickers all over New England at the time, Save Fenway Park. And when I interviewed Larry Lucchino before he passed and Janet Marie Smith a few years ago, I showed them that bumper sticker, and they were so proud to have been the duo along with Dr. Charles Steinberg, who really were instrumental of keeping and saving Fenway Park for another generation. And now I get to take my kids there, and other people get to do that. And I sadly don't get the same thing with old Comiskey Park. And that's something that really I lament all the time, that they never got to see it and feel it. And here's a good comparison showing Fenway from 2003 up top and Fenway from opening day, I think, of this year. It really functionally looks like the same ballpark, with the changes blending in well to the park. Obviously, the Green Monster seats are the biggest change. But as fickle as New Englanders can be, people like the seats. They become treasured seats, unusual, unlike anything else in the majors. And, also, of course, gave Manny Ramirez a place to still go to the bathroom. And really is something that I wish Comiskey Park had kept, but sadly, they didn't. Janet Marie Smith did all kinds of creative ways to find uses of Comiskey Park or of Fenway Park. They put a rooftop garden where they now supply vegetables to the restaurants that are in Fenway Park. They put in new seating all over the place, and found old warehouses in the outfield that they turned into the center field bullpen bar. They turned Jersey Street, formerly known as Yawkey Way, into a daytime experience, or a day of game experience, where you enter the ballpark and you're able to be part of the ballpark experience while on Jersey Street. But they didn't do that. And instead, we talk about kind of what if. Another what if is, what if the White Sox had opted for adaptive reuse? Maybe not reuse the entire ballpark and build the same structure, but do something like what they did at Soldier Field. At Soldier Field, which was built in the 1920s as a monument to World War I's fallen soldiers, there were the historic columns that you'll see on both sides of the stadium and the historic facade. Well, the Bears opted to keep those historic elements, but then put a brand new architecturally interesting stadium inside. Now, this is really controversial in Chicago. A lot of people complain that it's a spaceship plopped down on the old stadium. I would argue they built one of the best new football stadiums in the country at the time, with a really interesting architectural style, blending old and new, the way that we do all over New England. They do it all over Europe. You blend old and new architecture. My kids go through the same gate that I used to go through as a kid, going through Gate O for Bears games when I would go see Walter Payton. And I think that was a type of thing that I would have loved to have seen them done with Old Comiskey, keeping some elements of it. You can see right now what Soldier Field used to look like and the exact same view today of what it looks like. And you really have a lot of similar elements. You got the skyline, you've got the lakefront right there, you got the historic columns that are being treasured. Tangent outside the scope here is now they're talking about building a new Soldier Field just south of this, a topic for another day. Here's another comparison of the two. Soldier Field, within hours of losing to the Philadelphia Eagles in 2001 in the playoffs, they were already yanking out seats. This is the morning after the loss. They already started removing the seats. But you'll see the part that they retained. They kept that old facade. And as I said before, when you enter Soldier Field, it feels like what I used to feel like when I would enter from the tailgating. You still have the old columns coupled with modern architecture. And it feels like one of my favorite buildings in the south end of Boston, an old savings bank where they kept the facade and built a modern fancy condos inside of it. That's the type of thing where, like I said, you see it all over, and you're starting to see some stadiums start to do it here and there. Another great adaptive reuse is in England. My football soccer team is Arsenal FC. They played an old Highbury Stadium, Arsenal Stadium, which was built in 1913, a few years after Comiskey. They tore down and built a sanitized stadium just about a mile away. But instead of tearing down the stadium in its entirety, this is Emirates Stadium where they play now. It actually oddly feels a little bit like new Comiskey Park. But instead of tearing it down, the old soccer pitch is now a garden inside the Highbury Flats. They kept the two main parts of the stadium up, and you can see, here's the old view, and here is the new view. Those were all turned into flats on both sides of the pitch, and they kept the feel. The old entryway is now the lobby for the flats. And it's another option which you could have done. More recently in the States, Busch Stadium in St. Louis, BUSH, was where the minor league Indianapolis Indians played for decades and decades, as well as the Negro League Indianapolis Clowns, where Hank Aaron got his start. That was left to rot after they moved to Victory Field in downtown Indianapolis, and has since been turned into lofts. This has been featured all over the media recently. The developers took a flyer on this. I think they bought it for next to nothing, like $1 or $1,000, and turned it into very popular apartment lofts. And again, kept the treasured facade, which is now part of the loft units. And it was a great adaptive reuse, taking land that had been used for a ballpark that was obsolete for what they wanted with the fans being downtown, and kept something special. For those of you who know South Park, we cannot blame Canada for this problem. Canada is the gold standard for keeping old stadiums. Here's the old Montreal Forum, taken in 1990 something, I can't recall. and it is still standing, having been converted into an entertainment center. And the entire building envelope was retained. And inside, you can see where center ice used to be. There's a movie theater and shopping and offices there. And again, Habs fans can see where their heroes used to play, and they kept up the structure when the team moved downtown into the Molson Center. Even better, a generation later was Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. Here it is in 1988. They kept the entire building envelope. They turned the bottom level into Loblaws food store. The middle level is a gym and a basketball arena for a local university. And the top level kept the historic ceiling of Maple Leaf Gardens and is now a college hockey arena. So college players get to play under the same ceiling that their fathers and mothers used to see old stars back in the old days. Here's a look at the old seats, which has been turned into a Maple Leaf art installation inside the grocery store. Back in Montreal, the Olympic stadiums from 1976, a number of them were reused. The old velodrome was turned into the Biodome, which is now sort of an indoor zoo, essentially, and multi-climate experience. They kept the entire building envelope and facade and reused it and kept the structure. The old Houston Summit, then it was called the Compaq Center, is now a mega church for like 17,000 parishioners in Houston. They too moved downtown. The Pyramid, which once was the home of the Memphis Grizzlies for a brief time, as well as the University of Memphis basketball team, I guess wasn't a real good use for basketball. They turned it into now a Bass Pro Shop. So that still exists. But unfortunately, Comiskey Park did not have the same thing. I really wonder what could have been. You know, I thought even at the time in 1991, could they have kept the facade? Could they have kept it and maybe allowed everyone to park inside the ballpark and kept it as the parking structure facade? Could they have kept the center field bullpen and turned it into a sports bar or a museum or a gift shop? Something like that. Could they have retained that? You know, it wasn't the most valuable land in the area. There was certainly enough parking. There are a lot of things I think of what they could have done, but that wasn't necessarily the priority. I don't think it would have impacted the design too much for what they did with New Comiskey Park, but sadly, they did not keep any historic elements. The ballpark, as I mentioned before, was torn down in 1991. This was probably midsummer. You can see that they had the new ramps that were not fully complete yet at New Comiskey Park on the right side. Similarly, the same thing happened up the road on Madison Street with just a few years later, the same ownership group essentially did this with Chicago Stadium. They tore it down, and that was a stadium that also had a real treasured facade, historic Greco-Roman reliefs, and they built a similar kind of feel as New Comiskey Park across the street and tore down in 1995 old Chicago Stadium, leaving not a remnant there. To the best of my knowledge, there's not even a plaque, but I could be wrong on that. This shows you a little bit more of what old Chicago Stadium used to look like. And new United Center has a strangely similar feel to New Comiskey Park, where the upper deck is really pushed up by the club level and luxury suites. So that is sad. Another component that is a little disappointing is they didn't really leave much of a reminder up of old Comiskey Park. This is the original reminder. It was a home plate marker, which is discussed in the book. A certain Dan Evans convinced Rollie Heeman, the GM, that the team wasn't doing well with where the bullpen, with the home plate was, and they moved it up. I believe it was 9 feet. And I think it had previously moved back another time. So what does it even mean to have a marker for where home plate used to be? It had moved a bunch of times. So this really kind of gave White Sox fans and baseball fans cold comfort to have this. They have improved it since. It looks a little snazzier these days, but not much of a meaningful reminder. Again, Why couldn't the center field bleachers have been kept as some sort of advertising? They could have put, a big TV screen up there and shown out of town games or movies or something. Could have been a drive-in. I don't know. All kinds of creative thoughts could have been entertained, but sadly that wasn't the case. Forbes Field is one of the gold standards for those that have been to Pittsburgh. You can still see the wall where Bill Mazeroski hit his famous home run in 1960. Part of it still shows the ivy. Their home plate is in glass inside of the University of Pittsburgh's campus. Even better, down the street from where I live, you still can go sit in seats where all the Braves field used to be. Their old entry building is now part of Nickerson Field, of course, where BU plays sports. For many years, it was a football stadium before BU gave up football in the 90s. But still to this day, it is there as the BU police department. And you really can still feel kind of what it was like to have been in that old ballpark. Here shows the other side. A few seats were added, but those were the right field seats at Old Braves Field, now part of Nickerson Field, with dorms right behind there. That, of course, used to just be a mile away from Fenway Park. Cleveland also retained their ticket booth building or ticket building, and now there's a museum there at League Park. They put a baseball field. High school kids can play baseball where it used to be played. Atlanta kept the area where Hank Aaron hit his famous home run. I've learned recently they just announced they're going to build a baseball field there, I believe, for Georgia State. Is that correct? Yankee Stadium, of course, they left up parts of the field where kids can play today. They put a lot of meaningful memories of the old freeze in other parts. Sadly, they did not keep Tiger Stadium. I know that there had been discussions of keeping it up and turning it into housing. They did put up a new ballpark that you can still see that students and young people can play at, but they didn't do such a similar thing. Miller Park, when County Stadium was torn down, they built another childhood park or children's park where County Stadium used to be. And a new one that I saw recently, which was really interesting, where which started as a ballpark, Mile High Stadium, which was for the Denver Bears minor league team, I believe, of the PCL. That was torn down in favor of the Broncos' new stadium. They now built a miniature version of it for fans to hang out and congregate and tailgate right where 50-yard line used to be. But we don't have the same, unfortunately, with old Comiskey Park. Another thought is, another what if is, what if they had built a true replica? They would argue at the time that they kept in the arches. I wouldn't exactly say that the arches had the same feel of old Comiskey, but could they have done what they did with New Yankee Stadium? New Yankee Stadium is a replica of old Yankee Stadium, and they did a pretty good job, in my opinion, of capturing the feel of what it was like at old Yankee Stadium, combining pre-75 Yankee Stadium with the frieze on the facade, with a more modern feel of what the end use of Yankee Stadium was. You wonder about that. Another one is, of course, Shea Stadium did not in any way evoke Ebbets Field, but they did a good job with Citi Field of going back to what the Ebbets Field facade was and evoking the feel for Brooklyn Dodger fans who are still around of what that felt like. Another part is what would have happened had they turned the ballpark towards the skyline rather than towards the south and the projects that existed at the time. Now, I remember speaking at SABR last year to Dan, and I know that there were some soil conditions that were in place that prevented them from angling the ballpark towards the city. I would argue, although Dan would know better, you can always overcome soil conditions with money. But maybe that wasn't the case. But you wonder what would have happened if they built it with this view instead of going towards the projects that existed at the time that have since been torn down. You can see them over the field. You can also see the lake from the high up seats. You can't really see the lake anymore because you don't get that high anymore. But I wonder what that view would have looked like. This was not the ideal, inspiring view. Chicago arguably has one of the best skylines in the country, and it would have been a great backdrop the way that PNC Field has, or the University of Illinois Chicago Flames have one of the best backdrops of any university field I've ever seen. And this is just a few miles north and is analogous to what could have been a South Loop ballpark that had been bandied about, but the money just couldn't get together and you couldn't get the parties to agree on it at the time. Instead, we got what we got. Ironically, the White Sox AAA facility in Charlotte has one of the best skyline views of any ballpark. This is the Charlotte Knights ballpark. And even their minor league ballpark in Birmingham is a fantastic skyline view. This is for their AA team, which was built after, of course, Michael Jordan played in suburban Hoover. You didn't get a retro ballpark, but you also didn't get a donut cookie cutter ballpark with New Comiskey. Instead, what was happening at the time, and another what if, is what had happened if Camden Yards had been built first rather than New Comiskey Park. Camden Yards opened up in 1992, New Comiskey Park in 1991. And when New Comiskey Park opened up, this was the model of the ballpark that's on display in the club level, the stadium now. A similar design had been thrown about for New Camden Yards, or I don't know what the name was at the time. And you'll see this is one of the original plans. And if you look on the right, the main grandstand looks strangely like New Comiskey Park, both designed by HOK, now known as Populous, the stadium architecture firm for the world, really. I'd say 90% of stadiums in the world have been built by Populous. They first proposed something like this, and Larry Lucchino told me in an interview that he literally physically tore up the model they gave him because it looked so much like New Comiskey Park. He did not like the look and wanted something different and special, and took an extra year to design Camden Yards. I would guess a lot of White Sox fans would have tolerated an extra year if they got something like Camden Yards. At the time, retro ballparks were already starting. Pilot Field, which was the name then for the Buffalo Bison's team, the AAA team for, I think, Toronto at the time, maybe I'm wrong on that, opened up in 1988 as the first true retro park in the United States. So this was a concept being thrown around, but Jerry Reinsdorf was really enamored with what was at the time the gold standard ballpark, Royal Stadium. We were dealing with all the donut cookie cutters from the 60s and 70s, and Royal Stadium, which debuted, I believe, in 76 or 5, was the first baseball-only ballpark that was built in generations and was the gold standard. And that was really what, if you look at the design for New Comiskey Park, it looks a lot like Royal Stadium. And Jerry Reinsdorf talked about that a lot. The other new ballpark that came out in '89 was Skydome. And unequivocally, they didn't have the budget. Skydome cost 3 times as much as New Comiskey, and that wasn't what was going to be done in Chicago. But if you look at all the ballparks that were built after New Comiskey Park, it's hard for White Sox fans not to feel a little bit jealous. If you look at this, you see Cleveland in the upper right, upper left. Upper right is Houston. Middle left is Comerica, Tigers, where the Tigers play. Middle right is San Francisco. Lower left is Colorado. Lower right is Seattle. I think most White Sox fans would look at those and would feel a little warmer about those as a ballpark than what we got with New Comiskey. Now, interestingly, it's all coming full circle, and I'll conclude with this point. The White Sox now are discussing a ballpark in the South Loop. There's a developer named Related, which many people may have heard of as a big development company, and they would love to have the White Sox be the anchor component of a Parcel 78 ballpark, which is just north of this field and this view in Chinatown. You can't get to the site exactly right now, but this was taken a month ago, and you basically would have this skyline view, walkable from Sears Tower in the South Loop. The river would be right there. People could take river boats from the hotels that are along Michigan Avenue and the river. They could take the L. It goes right there as well. In my mind, this would correct a lot of wrongs in New Comiskey Park. It's still on the south side, so you wouldn't lose the tradition of being the South Siders. And I would argue that the 110 years on the corner of 35th and Shields has not been the luckiest corner for the White Sox. They have only won 2 World Series during that time. Maybe a move a few miles north would change their fortune, make them a little bit more fashionable in Chicago. Maybe change their fortunes. It's being discussed now. The state has said no. The city has said no on public funding. We'll see what happens. I know that I've read a lot about the Reinsdorf family would really like to get this resolved. He's not getting any younger. They certainly would like to get his situation resolved. And I'm personally crossing my fingers, hoping that Comiskey Park 3 will be the lucky charm in the just right ballpark. So that concludes my presentation. I'd love to take any questions if people have them. But that is kind of what I always think about in the last 20, 30 years. What could have been?
If you have questions for our presenter, Ken Smoller, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the reactions button. You'll see raise your hand, and we will get you in to talk to Ken. But Dan Evans, can you unmute? I was hoping you could say a few words about Comiskey, your time in Chicago and whatnot. You and I have spoken about this extensively in the past, especially in Baltimore when we were there. Talk to us a little bit about your experience at Comiskey, would you?
Sure. Well, first of all, hello to all the SABR members. You guys have a great chapter. And Ken Smoller is just awesome. Ken, I am so proud to be affiliated with the Last Comiskey documentary and the book. For me, folks, I mean, this is where I grew up on baseball. It's my hometown. And then I got to work there for its last 10 years, which is a real remarkable part of my life. I mean, it's where I evolved into the executive I became. But the fun part of Last Comiskey is that Ken does a fabulous job walking you through the ballpark in its non-playing areas, the vendors, the fans, the security people, some of the history. And that for me is glorious because so much of my life was spent there. I'll tell everybody a quick story, Ken, that I told you. I had a little corner office that Chuck Comiskey used for about 20 years. And the problem was when the upper deck was built, they didn't change the plumbing a whole lot. So whenever anybody flushed a toilet in the upper deck, I could hear it going right by my office. So I would have never been able to survive in a virtual platform in the old ballpark. But I will say that that ballpark built in 1910, you know, all the greats played there. The first All-Star game was played there. Folks, this book, and it's not, you don't have to be a Chicagoan to love the book. You just have to love baseball, architecture. Zachary Davis was the architect. Ken has captured it in such a special manner that when I saw that Bruce booked this, Ken, I have to admit I was all over this. And Dick Cramer's on this call. Dick is one of the founders of SABR and very honestly a mentor for me early in my career. And the things we did to change those dimensions was because of Dick Cramer's program. And so Kenny, tip of the cap to you. I love you. You know that. Folks, this is a baseball fan who is able to transfer his love to us in a book in such a wonderful way. Kenny, a huge, big clap for me. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. You were a big help with the book and corrected a few questions and facts that I needed, and I need to have you as my hype man everywhere I go. But
anytime. The hourly rate isn't that bad, so let's go.
Dan lived a dream. Dan, along with Don Paul, really lived a dream, being White Sox fans as kids and getting to be in that special ballpark and part of the transition. Listen, I'm sure you were part of a lot of really difficult conversations about what to do with the new ballpark. But I, you know, as is obvious, I'm approaching this both as a fan, but also I'm a real estate lawyer by training.
Yeah.
So I know about real estate deals and how they kind of come together, and you have to make choices. Can you do this? Can you not do that with funding and topography and soil conditions and whatnot? And from my perspective, I wish there were different choices made, starting with
Yeah.
Chick Gandil down the street.
Yeah. If I could,
Mhm.
just one thing, the last day of the ballpark, I had my then 3-month-old daughter, my first child, on my shoulder as the ballpark was basically being closed. It just a wonderfully choreographed ceremony that I'm really proud of to be a part of. And I couldn't go downstairs to make any presentations because my daughter had drooled so much on my shirt. So I asked the staff, I said,
Mhm.
somebody else has got to do this. And plus, I don't think I can be a part of this. I'm so saddened by the moment. This is where I grew up on baseball. My dad was there. It was just a really emotional time for me. And candidly, Ken, I was looking at your book the other day when I was cleaning up my office a little bit. And the day they started wrecking the ballpark, I just couldn't go out.
Yeah.
I couldn't watch it because that was my youth being destroyed. And it was also the first 10 years of my career. And I just couldn't do it. And
Yeah.
I looked at it and I thought, wow, I didn't realize it impacted me that much that day. And to this day, I have no Comiskey Park memorabilia except for a great photo because I just want to pretend like it didn't go away, that it's still there.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really a special place. And White Sox fans really loved it because it was kind of our place. Cub fans had their place. And Cub fans, I always say, they had the arrogance of Yankee fans with none of the reasons for having the arrogance. They hadn't won, they didn't want anything, but they always acted that way towards us. And I grew up in the Northwest suburbs, so I grew up in Cub country. I was the only Sox fan. And, we had that park, and we had Nancy Faust and that scoreboard, and we had Harry Carey when I was a little kid. And when he left, that was real depressing.
And it smelled like a ballpark, Ken. It
Yeah.
sounded like a ballpark. It was never a stadium. It was a ballpark. I mean, the churros, the popcorn, the beer vendors, everything about it. Folks, if you get the book, if Ken had smell-o-vision, it would have been included because that ballpark it was a ballpark. And that was the best part about it.
We talk about that. Tom Scher shared, he was a consultant and was my editor. He shared a fact that I didn't know, that Bill Veeck always insisted that popcorn be freshly popped, not brought in off-site. He wanted that smell.
Yep.
And I never knew that it was distinctive, but you'd walk in, there was a certain smell. There was this fried onion smell. Chicago hot dogs have fried onions. You smell it at the new park, but it's not the same. Then, of course, 80 years of beer. So you think when you go like a frat house or a party, you have like that disgusting smell, but it was 80 years. But somehow it kind of worked. There was always a smell of marijuana too. I didn't know it at the time, but I remember asking my parents when I was a kid, "What's that smell? What's that smell?" They always would smell that. And then the cool smell was the fireworks. If you had the fireworks, you had that post-fireworks sulfur. And because you had the twin decks, it all got trapped. If there were back-to-back fireworks, the smoke would congregate and it wouldn't dissipate on those stagnant summer nights in Chicago. And you'd smell that. Plus the cut grass from the best groundkeeper to this day, Roger Bossard. And it really was. Like I talk about it in the end, it hit every sense. You felt it rocking. You listened to Nancy's music or na 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 na. And it was a real visceral ballpark. It was very rarely full. You got excited when you'd see the upper deck with a few fans, but you could have 5,000 people there, and it was so loud because it would all echo. Unlike Fenway Park, which is loud, you didn't have the outfields trapped the noise. So it really was special. I did see there was questions. Should I go around?
I got some questions up here. I want to make sure that I get Dick Cramer in as well. Dick, can you hear me, buddy?
Oh, yeah.
Dick, you were in the chat talking about. Go ahead. You were talking about it.
Well, I wrote one of the first programs that could record play-by-play in connection with stats, which is still around. And the White Sox were our second customer, and I had met several visits as we sort of added pitch type and location to the record that was being made. There were only fastballs. There were no cutters, certainly no sweepers. But it was a very nice place. I worked with several different clubs at that time because Stats customers were baseball teams. For me, this is all a joy. It was sort of a part that I had other things I was, I've always been with regard to the why Comiskey didn't survive, one of the key players while I was there was Jack Gould, who was very close to Jerry Reinsdorf, the chief financial guy. The White Sox actually got this system because Jack Gould wanted better material to go into player negotiations with. Dan found more additional useful things to do with it. Very creative. He told me another story when I last saw him at SABR last year. But Jack, anyway, to get to the point, Jack Gould, for some reason, it was off season and he was just showing me around the stadium, and got up to the roof and he said, well, it's a pity we just would like to, of course, keep this place going, all its tradition, but you can't put in roof boxes, as Dave Mundo, I think, commented. It was architecturally, for whatever reason, he was quite a little bit apologetic. I mean, I didn't have strong emotional feelings about Comiskey, but it was, I thought, considering who Jack was, and I think it was probably quite a relevant statement that he made. There are lots of stories about working with the clubs at that time. After that, of course, the Stats became a consumer oriented company, and other stories there. But Comiskey, that was definitely my favorite place to go and talk to the ball clubs. It was great. And Dan, of course, was very hospitable. I was so impressed with how aware Dan was of everything that was happening in the field while I was sitting next to him as he was entering the game.
Fantastic. Dick, thank you very much. Dixie, you're up.
Ken, great photography, first of all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Superb. And since you live 2 miles from Fenway and I only live a mile from Fenway, you must live within 2 miles of me.
Yeah. I live in Washington Square.
I'm on Mission Hill in Boston.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm doing a book launch event a month from yesterday, or the 15th at the Abbey. The Abbey Bar in Brookline.
Okay.
In Washington Square, we're going to do a book launch event there. So come on by, come say hi.
Speaking of the baseball goddess of Chicago, I have this.
Wow.
Which
we may need you to record that.
I had Nancy sign at the SABR welcoming thing last year.
Yeah. We may need to. I've looked for that all over eBay.
Oh, I bought it
35
years ago.
Yeah. I mean, that's how special she was, People wanted to take that music home.
That's right.
I'm not going to spoil it. I talk about it in the book. My afterword of the book is all about getting to know Nancy personally, and her getting to know my son, my then 13-year-old son. She is, and I'm not the only one. There's just dozens and dozens of stories of her just taking someone and treating them like family. That's just what she did. She's a real special person.
Have you ever listened to Keith Olbermann's podcast?
I have. I've also seen her piece, piece about her.
He uses her to do some of the organ and things on his podcast.
I'm gonna have to
every
check
single
that.
day.
Oh, then I've listened to an old version.
You have
Or
got to
maybe-
listen to it because at the
Right.
end he goes through all the people who have helped him on the podcast for that particular segment. And every single night he says, Nancy Faust, the best baseball organist ever.
Yeah. I need to reach out to him.
One last
But
thing is I was
please.
at the last 3 games at Comiskey. I was
It was a
there for
weird
them.
weekend.
And on Friday night, I thought for sure I was going to die because they lit up the entire roof with the fireworks.
Yeah.
And we all thought that the entire roof was on fire. And we were sitting in the ballpark.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable.
On Saturday night, I went to Saturday and Sunday because I was in Michigan at college and I drove back to Chicago. I went Saturday for the final fireworks show. They did one of the coolest things I ever saw. They installed fireworks in the light standards, and to this theme of the natural, they recreated that scene of the famous fireworks coming out of the standards after the home run. And it was just amazing. There's a photo you'll see around on the internet. I think it was a Tribune photographer did an extended shutter of it. And it was just so beautiful and magical. I just was bawling when it happened, I remember. But
that's why everyone
always
thought they
did
were
great
going to die.
fireworks. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go to Dave Mondo. Dave, how you doing tonight, my friend?
Hey, pretty good, guys. I'm driving. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Hey,
Perfect.
you thought you were gonna die during that last weekend. I was at Disco Demolition night. How do you? Oh my God, I was like 7 years old.
There's a vendor who talks about that. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah. go ahead, Ken. Okay.
There was a vendor who talks about
say,
being nearly killed at Disco Demolition, and then he came to the realization that he's walking around with hundreds of dollars of beer money, and he was worried that he was going to get jumped, and got out of there.
That's great. That's amazing. Hey, one more thing about Nancy, Ken. I was going to ask you this, and Dan, maybe you know this. One really unique thing is that Nancy was almost like in the middle of the stand, right? She wasn't hidden away in some upper deck. She was right there, surrounded by fans. You know, they cut over to her during Take Me Out to the Ball Game, and you could see fans like, you know, within arm's reach of her. What was the story? Was that something that was instituted a little later, or how did that come?
No, she started in center field in the bleachers. The booth is photographed and you can see it in there. And then Harry Carey, when he saw her there, encouraged the team to bring her over closer to his booth. He was behind home plate, upper deck, and she was just to the left of him as you look at the field. She was on the third base side, and they were, you know, within eyesight of each other so they could have an interplay, which led to the 7th inning stretch situation where they would sing. He would sing along with her. And she talks about that all the time, that fans would give her recommendations and ideas. And it was a real big part of why she was so beloved, because everyone knew her. It bums me out at Fenway. They have a wonderful organist now who's a protege of Nancy. He actually went and learned from her. And he, unfortunately, is not amongst the fans. He's kind of behind the scenes. He does a modern interpretation, though. He's always talking to fans on Twitter, taking recommendations. So you'll be there in the stands, they tweet it to him, say, hey, can you play some Grateful Dead? 3 innings later, it's like, here you go. And he, you know, plays the song. And so it's kind of a neat modern version. I just wish he could be around the fans and they could see him, because he's a real special organist. There are a lot of great organists now still there. Sadly, the White Sox retired her a little earlier than I think she should have been retired. And a lot of ballparks now really do a good job blending organ music with rock or rap or whatever. They do a little bit of each, and you just get that instantaneous feel with organists. I'm sure a lot of you guys saw at Dodger Stadium, they had a fire in the outfield parking lot recently, and the organist jumped right into "We Didn't Start the Fire," the Billy Joel song, to kind of, you know, make fun of this. No one was hurt, so make fun of the situation. You get that from an organist. You get that interplay. And over a 3-hour game, it's fun to have.
You're right, and you could walk right up to her before a game, between innings, suggest a song, and she'd play it. Like I went to the University of Illinois, and I'd say, "Hey, Nancy, play the Illinois fight song," and boom, like she'd play it within.
She always did the Big Ten medley. She would play all the Big Ten fight songs and throw in Notre Dame as well. I used to love that before the game, especially at football season. She would do that, and when the Bears won a game, she played "Bear Down Chicago Bears," and she would do things to kind of integrate everything going on into the game. Oh, she played by ear, by the way. She does not know how to read music, so it's amazing.
Dixie,
incredible.
Didn't the organist at Fenway Park buy Nancy's organ?
I think I read that somewhere. Yeah, he, Josh. I can't think of his last name. Is it Kaplan? No, that's not right. Josh, I'm forgetting the last name. He, learned from her, learned her style, learned her sense of humor. Another person that's similar. If you go back to old David Letterman show, Paul Schaefer did a real similar kind of approach. He always had kind of funny songs based on what the interviewee was doing or things Dave would say. He had a similar style. I kind of thought they were like two sides of a coin. His approach to what Nancy Faust used to do. It
was Josh Cantor, who was the
Josh
organist.
Cantor, okay. I had Kaplan in my brain. Yeah.
So, all right. Tell us, my friend Ken, how do we get our hands on this book?
LastComiskeyBook.com. We're trying to avoid Amazon. So LastComiskeyBook.com, and I post photos all the time at Stadium Vagabond on social media. I love sharing my photos with people of all these trips around the world. My wife is sick of seeing stadium photos, so I like to share them with people who like ballparks and stadiums. And I like to share these photos and talk about, for those folks who don't travel as much as I do, what it's like to go to a baseball game in Puerto Rico or Japan. And so that's Stadium Vagabond, and the book's at LastComiskeyBook.com.
This has been a rollicking over an hour of reminiscence that is second to none. And Dan Evans made a comment before he had to skedaddle in the chat. He made the comment, "Tonight is another reason why I so love being a part of SABR. I'm one of the lucky ones." And I have got to echo those sentiments based on this meeting, the encouragement Dan gave me when I wanted to start this chapter, and just the fact that there are so many people out there who come to these meetings every week. And I really, really appreciate all of you. And I appreciate you, Ken, for doing this as well. This has been
my pleasure.
Absolutely fantastic. Now, next week, June 24th at 7 p.m., we're going to have Bob Fitzpatrick with us. Bob is a fellow SABR member, and he is just off his very well-received appearance at the Frederick Ivor Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference, where he gave his presentation entitled Forgotten Civil Rights Icon, Octavius V. Cato. He'll be sharing that presentation with us next week. Don't miss it. This is sure to be a unique and very interesting conversation. Now, finally, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, as well as thank you to those who are watching at home after the fact on YouTube. If you like what we're doing up here in Northern New England, please subscribe to our channel to get alerts for each of our weekly uploads. And if you're a baseball fan, you need to join SABR, the premier baseball community, offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom. SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 70 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Ken, you're fantastic. Thank you very much for doing this. Yep.
Thanks so much. Nice talking to everyone.
We appreciate you. We're going to get everybody out of here. We're going to see you next week. Have a good night, everybody.